Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan Cohen. This is Mint Press News Live, and it is Monday afternoon here in DC, 2 p.m. And we're going to be watching the new documentary that we just released on Mint Press News called Gaza Fights Back. I directed it, and we're going to watch the movie. So hopefully everyone will join in. If you've already watched it, that's great. If you haven't, now's a good time. Afterwards, we'll have a discussion with. I'll be hosting, of course, and we'll discuss. We have Motaz Aziza, who was the producer and cameraman in Gaza, who filmed this incredible footage during the 11-day assault on the Gaza Strip in May 2021. And then we also have the journalist and author Ramzy Baroud, who's going to join us as well. And I'm really looking forward to having this talk with people who know Gaza so well. And so I think let's just get started. And we are now going to watch Gaza Fights Back. See if I can get this thing running properly, which I think I'll be able to. If anyone in the chat, let me know if there's any issues with the stream, but I think we should be able to get this going. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I'm just showing. There we go.
On May 10th, 2021, the armed wing of Hamas issued a warning to Israel. Withdraw your settlers and soldiers from the East Jerusalem.
All right, hang on 1 second. We're going to get this going. So just bear with me, everyone. I'm going to just trying to figure out how to work everything.
Neighborhood.
There we go. Okay. So we're going to rewind, go to the very beginning. Looks all right. It's all good. Looks like everyone in the comments is saying this is working well. So I'm going to check out here. I'll be watching the documentary. And without further ado, this is the latest Mint Press News documentary and called Gaza Fights Back. And so and please, everyone, I should say, also share this stream. Or if you're watching it later, share this because Mint Press News is heavily, heavily censored. We're fighting algorithms, so if you share it, that helps us fight back against the censorship. And make sure you check us out on Telegram and all social media platforms. So thanks again.
On May 10th, 2021, the armed wing of Hamas issued a warning to Israel. Withdraw your settlers and soldiers from the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the armed resistance groups will carry out military operations.
The Palestinian resistance did not engage the Al-Quds event suddenly, but it was preceded by a series of public demonstrations which refused the Israeli sinister schemes to forcibly evict the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood.
For weeks, Palestinians had been demonstrating against Israeli settler takeovers of homes in Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood being ethnically cleansed of its residents. Demonstrations had expanded to the Al-Aqsa compound, where ultra-nationalist Israeli settlers had been staging provocative visits flanked by heavily armed soldiers. As demonstrations grew, Israeli occupation forces stormed the mosque in an unprecedented show of aggression in the holy site.
The Israeli violations reached its limits, and Israel kicked off the ethnic cleansing and displacement process. These displacement processes were accompanied by different calls to break into Al-Aqsa Mosque in the holy month of Ramadan by the Israeli right-wing extremist and fascist groups.
Israeli leadership ignored the warning and authorized a provocative march of thousands of nationalist Israelis parading through the heart of Palestinian life in occupied East Jerusalem. Palestinian armed groups followed through on their warning, launching dozens of rockets towards Jerusalem and sending the Israeli marchers fleeing for cover.
These are images of people running for shelter. That's what's happening. You can see, we heard a loud boom.
They were not necessarily aiming at hitting civilian infrastructure per se. They are not aiming at killing ordinary people. They were aiming to send a very strong message. As Israel comes and disrupts life in Gaza, destroy the economic infrastructure in Gaza, create this awful, genocidal experience that is felt at a collective level, levels of Gazan societies, they are able to do something somewhat similar, which is pushing millions of Israelis into shelters and completely stopping life in all of its sectors, whether economic or social or political.
Within hours, Israeli warplanes were in the air, carrying out bombing runs on the defenseless Gaza Strip. Its first targets were some of the tallest towers in Gaza. These are the icons of the middle and upper class, the last symbols of prosperity. Meanwhile, Gaza's armed resistance was deep inside an underground labyrinth of tunnels, protected from Israel's bombs and prepared for a possible ground invasion. On May 13th, just after midnight, the Israeli military announced to the international press that its ground troops were attacking inside the Gaza Strip. As the media announced Israel's declaration, warplanes carried out a ferocious bombing campaign, launching some 450 missiles in a 40-minute period. But this turned out to be a ruse. Israel had lied and enlisted the international press in an attempt to use psychological warfare to draw the resistance forces into the entrances of the tunnel system and kill them under heavy bombardment. Gaza's militant groups, however, did not fall for the trap.
The Palestinians' intelligence device knew and followed the Israeli ongoing behavior during the last Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip. We had pinpoint intelligence information about that.
The Israeli military immediately announced to the world that the campaign was a success, had killed dozens of top commanders, hundreds of fighters, and incapacitated the Al-Aqsa Brigade's ability to launch rockets. But militants in Gaza continued to fire towards Tel Aviv. This forced the Israeli military and media to revise their claims, admitting that the plan was a failure and a lie.
הלילה, נתחיל מהסוף, לא ידוע כמה מחבלים נהרגו שם, כי יש המון שמועות וכל מיני, כל אחד עוד משדרג את הסיפור הזה של הלילה.
עשרות?
עשרות, כנראה עשרות, לא יודעים כמה עשרות. שני עשרות, 20, 30, 40, עשרות, אבל מעריכים לא יותר מזה.
While Israel's bombing campaign killed only a handful of fighters, civilians paid the price.
أنا اسمي أمل رمزي محمد نصير، عمري 11 سنة من مدينة بيت حامد. جينا ننام الساعة 1 تماما بالضبط، في صوت انفجارات، في صوت قصف صواريخ قريبة علينا. من كتر حمل الهواية صارت الدار تتزلزل، والبطارية كنا ضوين على حنا البطارية وقعت، والقزاز هيك تناثر علينا وهب علينا، والابواب زي هيك. فيعني شو نضلنا نسوي في الدار؟ طلعنا برا لقينا كل الحاره مقلوب قلاب. صرنا نسال الاولاد عمي يعني شو في، اكيد الحاره انقصفت، لانه ما كناش نعتقد انها هي حتنقصف، لانه يعني هذا الحي حي مدني، لا يعني مواطنين فيش فيه اي شيء. طلعنا برا قالوا يعني دورنا انقصفت، طلعنا واحنا مش عارفين اي دار، طلعنا وزي الستات بشعور هين وزينا احنا بدون شباشب واحنا حافين. رحنا على المستشفى، قعدنا في المستشفى لما طلع الصبح. رحنا نشوف يعني اي دار انقصفت، هل الحاره كلها انقصفت ولا لا. رحنا لقينا كل المحيط اللي كان يحوينا والمأوى اللي كان يحوينا كله مقصوف، فيش فيه دار الا مقصوفه.
Having played their strongest card without gaining any strategic advantage, Israeli military planners turned their attention back to the soft targets in the center of Gaza City. This time, Al-Jalaa, a residential and commercial tower that housed the most prominent international media offices in Gaza, from Al Jazeera to the Associated Press.
جواد محمود مهدي، العمر 68 عام، رجل أعمال. الساعة 1:30 بيطرق علي الباب، ابن أخويا وابني بيزعقوا اسمع اسمع اسمع. ضربة باب قوية جدا، شيء مش طبيعي، يعني مش ضربة واحد جاي يزورك او يسلم عليك. خد كلم جيش الدفاع الاسرائيلي. ايش بتحكي جيش الدفاع الاسرائيلي؟ الو مرحبا، بحكي بعربية يعني مكسرة شوية، يمكن سمعتوها كلكم على التيوب. ايش اللي في؟ احنا جيش الدفاع الاسرائيلي معك، انت جواد مهدي؟ قلت له نعم صح انا جواد مهدي. قال احنا حنهيل البرج وننزله في الارض اللي جنبيك. شو بتحكي؟ قال انتم مش فرحتوا لضرب تل ابيب؟ احنا هننزل البرج، هذا قرار جيش الدفاع الاسرائيلي، نزل البرج وما بتكلم معي اكثر من هيك. انا جيش الدفاع بعطيك الاوامر تخلي البيت. اطلع لي كم طابق عندك؟ قلت له عندي 12 طابق. قال اطلع على الطابق 12، بتروح على الاي بي في الاول وبعدين الجزيره.
فارس 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 ان شاء الله ما بنقصك يا راجل، بس يلا امشي يا اخي. يلا يا حاج حاولوا تنزلوا على الدرج على الدرج. ابو العيد طلع برا على هناك.
سامع بدك تتكلم لهالوقت على كاميرا؟ ما بدي احكي على كاميرا، خلص ما بدي. بدك يا سوي انا حسكر واعمل اللي بدك اياه. في رب كبير.
بصورة تلقائية وعفوية انهار البرج. فكانت يعني ربما تعبر عن بعض من المشاعر اللي بتجول في داخل الإنسان وبتتفاعل داخل الإنسان، لأنه المكتب هذا مش حجار، مش أثاث، مش قطع بعض الشغلات، لكن هذا مكتب بنيناه طوبة، جهاز، كيبل. يعني كل حاجة فيه أخذت منا، استغرقت زمن حتى تم بناؤه وتجهيزه، وحتى يكون قادر على تغطية الأحداث بما يتناسب مع حجم ووزن وانتشار وتأثير شبكة الجزيرة الإعلامية. وفي لحظة انهار البرج.
لما انهارت العمارة انهارت معنا 25 سنة ذكريات. 25 سنة انت عايش في هذا المكان مع اولادك، مع احفادك، مع جيرانك، مع اصحابك. تصور انت بيت بتبنيه يعني بطوبة جزء يعني بالحلم وبالعلم. انت قاعد بتكون بتعيش في بيت، فجأة تلاقي نفسك انت برا هذا البيت. مأساة ما حد بيقدر يعني يوصفها، انك انت تطرد من بيتك في سواعيات دقيقة تحت يعني ذرائع مش موجودة، تحت ذرائع لا أخلاقية، ذرائع يعني ما حدش بيقدر يستقبلها.
Having destroyed 3 of Gaza's most important towers, Israel set its sights on Al Ramal, the Strip's commercial center.
حي الرمال هو الحي الرئيسي أو قلب مدينة غزة. هذا هو المركز الاقتصادي والتجاري لمدينة غزة ولمعظم سكان قطاع غزة. عملية التسوق تأتي من الجنوب ومن الشمال، الناس بتيجي تتسوق من هذا المكان. استهدف الاحتلال هذا المكان كونه مركزا اقتصاديا وتجاريا للمدينة. طبعا تم تدمير برج الشروق في هذا المكان، هذا أعلى برج موجود في شارع عمر المختار. طبعا هذا شارع عمر المختار هو الشارع الحيوي والرئيسي في مدينة غزة. تم استهداف شارع عمر المختار في عدة مناطق، منها من عند أبو خضرة، عند السرايا، مفرق السرايا، مفرق أبو خضرة، هذا شريان رئيسي، طريق رئيسي مؤدي لحي الرمال. استهداف البرج الموجود فيه، المراكز التجارية تم استهدافها.
Among the homes targeted was the Abu Lalof residence.
نزل علينا الصاروخ الأول على الشارع بدون لا تحذير ولا مكالمة ولا أي شيء. بعدها نزل علينا الصاروخ الثاني وأبوي ما رضيش يقوم عشان إحنا منطقة مدنية وفكر إنه الهواية بعيدة، فنزل علينا الصاروخ الثاني. الدار صارت تروح يمين وشمال وبقوة يعني. سحبت أختي من إيدها وحضنتها. فجأة نزل علينا الصاروخ الثالث من الشباك طلع منه نار، والحيط الممر انهدت علينا والسقف كله وقع علينا. بعدها ضلينا يعني ثابتين شوية. بعدها نزل علينا الصاروخ الرابع، حطنا يعني احنا الطابق الثاني حطنا تحت الشارع يعني طالونا تحت من هناك من الزاوية من هناك.
As bombs rained down, first responders rushed to the scene.
الكل بخير؟ شوف فكت الناس اللي جوا، فكت الناس.
For days, rescue teams searched through massive piles of rubble, hoping to find signs of life. By the end, 44 people were killed and 50 injured in what became known as the Wahda Street massacre. Marwan Abu Lalof lost 22 family members in the attack.
كل اللي استشهدوا كلهم عبارة عن أبرياء، تمام. كلهم يعني إذا أنت ملاحظ كلهم أطفال كبار في السن ونساء، تمام. يعني عندنا إحنا في البناية عندنا 6 نساء، أطفال 4 أطفال، عمي راجل كبير في السن يعني 76 سنة، ابن عمي 50 سنة، عمي دكتور، ابن عمي دكتور. فيش عندنا يعني حدا نقول مثلا يعني كلهم اللي دار جيراننا 22 شهيد، معظمهم أطفال ونساء. لما شفت المنظر، شفت العمارة على الأرض عبارة عن بطول مصفط فوق بعض، قلت إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون، حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. شعوري شعور صدمة، تمام. حاليا في البداية ما كناش حاسين، حاليا بدينا نحس بالإشي. يعني لقيت لما أنا بكون قاعد بيجي على بالي أيمن، بيجي على بالي عمي، بيجي على بالي مرت عمي، بيجي أختي، أولادها، بنات أخويا، مرت أخويا. تبدأ إيش؟ تبدأ تستذكر ثانية لحظات، الكلام، الأوقات اللي كنت تقضيها معهم. أحلامهم، أمالهم. يعني بنات أخويا تنتين، واحدة المفروض عرسها ب 28/5، وواحدة الشهر هذا شهر 6. تنتين المفروض يعني كان المفروض انه يعني بعد يعني اثناء الحرب المفروض كان ضايل 10 ايام العرس ميسه كبيره، تمام. والثاني الشهر هذا او شهر 6 الشهر الجاي. كل هذه راحت.
He takes care of his nephew and niece, whose mother was killed in the massacre.
في واواهان كمان. استنى فرجي الواوا الثانية.
في واوا.
هيها واوا الثانية.
شجاعك؟
لا.
حط شاطر انت.
تابت.
شوف هي. شوف هذه. يا.
قول لعمو ايش عملوا اليهود. قول لعمو ايش عملوا فينا اليهود. قول فرجي الواوا، قول له ايش عملوا؟ قول له قصفوا علينا الدار.
Marwan's niece recalls the night of terror.
لما قطفوا أول ضربة ترجوا الباب، بعدها رحنا دخلنا في الممر، بعدين لما قصفوا دخل في إشي هيك إشي مدور مش عارفة شو هو، بس دخل علينا وصار كل السماء أحمر، فحسينا إشي هيك برجعنا قاعد لورا، وفجأة لقينا حنا نايمين على الممر بالممر، ولقينا كل السقف موجود.
مين كان جنبك؟ يا عم هي عم مين كان جنبك؟ مين كان جنبك يا عمو؟ مين كان جنبك؟ مين؟
أختي ميسة.
بس وحدة؟ وماما وبابا؟
بابا ما عرف وينه.
كان في الدار؟ اي بابا برا، ماما بقى جوا ماما؟
بابا يا بابا أنا
Maysa Abulolof was trapped under the rubble too.
تقريبا ساعة ونص يا ساعتين وأنا تحت لحديت ما إجوني يعني طلعوني. صرت أول أنادي على أهلي كانوا يردوا، بعدها سكتنا كلنا ما سمعتش حد. رد علي واحد قال لي دقيقة وراح أطلعك، قلت له أنا مش متحملة إنه أضلني دقيقة، يعني إنه يجي بسرعة يطلعني. صار يدور يعني حفر حفرة، شفت ضوء، قلت لهم أنا هيني تحت يعني إنه تعالوا لي. حفر بزيادة، طل أختي مرام أول وحدة، طبعا طلعت وياها مصدومة إيش اللي أنا فيه هذا. طلعت بعدها نزلني، طبعا أحمد ما كانش مبين. لما نزل المنقذ تحت شافه قال لي بتتحملي أطلعه وبعدين أطلعك؟ قلت له بتحمل. طلعه وأنا هيني بستنى تحت مش مشكلة. اللي هو طلعه وبعدها ثواني اللي أنا يعني دغري طلعني وراه، ما طولتش. بعد طبعا رحنا على المستشفى. طبعا أنا كنت بعرف إنه أخت شيماء استشهدت لأنه كانت جنبي. روان يعني أكيد استشهدت، وعرفت فيها ماما كانت يعني كتير تعبانة تحت، وهي كانت في العناية. وبعدها سفروها برا، يعني ودوها على رام الله، بعدين ودوها على إسرائيل، وبيحكوا لي حالتها يعني إنه شوي شوي بتتحسن، يعني العلاج ببطء بيستجيب معاها يعني حتى الآن، والله يشفيها.
One day after this interview was filmed, Maysa's mother, Diana Abulolof, died of her injuries in an Israeli hospital. Most prominent among those killed in the Wahda massacre was Dr. Ayman Abulolof, one of the most senior physicians in all of Gaza and the figure tasked with overseeing the enclave's COVID-19 response. He had just returned home from a long shift at Al-Shifa Hospital when the bombs hit his house.
هو ابويا يعني استاذ ورئيس قسم في مستشفى الشفا. قبل القصف ما كانش له يعني مروح من المستشفى الا نص ساعه. كان بيساعد الناس يعني وخدوم كثير. كل الدكاتره فعليا بحبوه.
لقد خسرنا أيمن، قد خسرنا الدكتور أيمن بمعنى الكلمة. لم يكن نموذجا اعتياديا، ولكن كان نموذجا طبيا ذات همة عالية، عزيمة لا تلين.
يعني دكتور أيمن بالعوف صراحة من الأطباء الذي عرفناهم يعني بصمت عملهم، يعني من الذين يعملون ليل نهار في هذا المجمع، وهو رئيس قسم الباطنة وهو المسؤول الأول عن جائحة كورونا في هذا المجمع. دكتور أيمن يعني كان جل عمله وجل حياته مكرسة في هذا المجمع، قضى أكثر من 20 عاما وهو يعمل في مجمع الشفاء الطبي بين المرضى وبين أيضا. الدكتور أيمن كان يدرس في كلية الطب في الجامعة الإسلامية وجامعة الأزهر، وكان يدرب الطلبة وطلبة الامتياز. كان يدرب الأطباء الذين تخرجوا حديثا، كان معاملته يعني مع الجميع جيدة جدا، كانت علاقتنا تربط، يعني كنا نقضي سويا معا في هذا المجمع أكثر ما يقضي في بيوتنا. دكتور أيمن صراحة خسارة كبيرة للمجمع. دكتور أيمن يعني بفقدانه خسر مجمع الشفاء الطبي والمجمع الأكبر في قطاع غزة، قامة علمية كبيرة، لكن الحمد لله رب العالمين دكتور أيمن ترك من بعده أجيال ما زالت على دربه يعلمون الأطباء ويداوون المرضى.
الدكتور أيمن كان من الزملاء العزيزين على قلوبنا جميعا، لم يكن صديقا وزميلا فقط بل كان أخا عزيزا فاضلا.
عندما استقبلنا الدكتور أيمن كأنما تخطفتنا الطير وأسقط في يدنا، وكنا في حالة ذهول كبيرة جدا جدا جدا، أنه خيم الصمت في كل أرجاء المكان الذي كان يتواجد فيه الدكتور أيمن أبو العوف. ولأن هذا الطبيب يستقر في قلوب كافة زملائه، دون أن نعلن عن وصول الدكتور أيمن أبو العوف إلى المجمع، تناقل الجميع أن الدكتور أيمن قد وصل شهيدا، وإذا بكافة من يعملون في المجمع يتوافدون إلى قسم الطوارئ، مما اضطرنا إلى وضع الدكتور أيمن في ساحة المستشفى لينظره ويودعه كافة زملائه ويصلون عليه ويودعونه.
الله أكبر. نشهد لك يا دكتور أيمن أنك قد أديت الرسالة التي أوكلت إليك حق أداء. تشهد لك مرافق وزارة الصحة ومجمع الشفاء الطبي أنك كنت تواصل الليل بالنهار، وأنك كنت في كل لحظة وفي كل موقف خير إنسان، وأنك وقفت مع الإنسان الفلسطيني وقدمت كل ما يمكن أن يقدم.
Despite global outrage, the bombing continued. Israel targeted every aspect of civilian life it could, from residential buildings and TV towers to ice cream shops and bookstores.
طبعا هذا المكتب تبعته مكتب السمير منصور، هذا الدمار اللي صار فيها. طبعا المكتبة بتتكون من دورين، جميع أنواع الكتب اللي هي الثقافية والدينية، الأدب، الروايات، كل ما يخص القارئ كله موجود. يعني من كل مكتبة احنا ناشرين بننشر الكتب ونترجم الكتب. طبعا النشر تبعنا بيتم عن طريق الكتاب الفلسطينية في قطاع غزة، فوق ال 150 كاتب احنا بننشر لهم الكتب. هذا لحد ما سمعنا على الجزيرة اجينا وقفنا عندها قبل ما تنزل العمارة، يعني انه واصلين قبل دقيقتين او 3 دقائق. من حد ما وصلنا تم استهداف نزول المبنى كله، زي ما انت شايف كيف الاضرار الموجوده. طبعا هذا كله تعب وشقى سنوات طويله من 20-25 سنه، وانا بأسس في الكلام هذا. المكتبه بتشكل لي حاجات كبيره كثير، زي يعني زي اولادي. فالحمد لله الاشي يعني راح، وايش نساوي يعني.
Meanwhile, casualties continued to arrive at the hospital. At night, families with nowhere to hide took refuge outside. An autistic girl, terrified and unable to express herself. Inside the hospital, paramedics rushed injured patients for emergency operations. This child sustained head wounds. Day after day, as civilian casualties mounted, Israel rejected ceasefire proposals with full backing from the Biden administration.
כל יום שעובר, אנחנו פוגעים בעוד יכולות של ארגוני הטרור. מסכלים עוד מפקדים בכירים, מפילים עוד מגדלי טרור, פוגעים בעוד מצבורי נשק. כפי שאמרתי היום לשגרירים שנאספו כזו, הזכות הטבעית של ישראל. אני הערכתי מאוד את התמיכה של הממשלות האלה, ואני מעריך במיוחד את התמיכה של נשיא ארצות הברית ידידנו ג'ו ביידן בזכות ההגנה העצמית של מדינת ישראל.
Finally, after 11 days of relentless attacks by air, land, and sea, a ceasefire was declared. The people of Gaza took to the streets to celebrate what they saw as a victory over their occupiers. Tens of thousands of Palestinians who had taken shelter in crowded schools began to return to their homes, or what was left of them.
أنا مواطن سكن محمد نصير من بيت حنون، أسكن في هذا الحي. طبعا أنا صاحب هذا البيت. شفنا جينا إحنا بعد ما خلصت الهدنة وقفت، جينا على الحي تبعنا، لقينا المنظر هذا، لقينا الدار مدمرة يعني والمنطقة كلها خربانة، فكان الشعور يعني حزن وكان يعني ألم كبير جدا، لأن فقدنا البيت وأصبحنا بدون مأوى والحين صرنا زي مشردين.
أنا المواطن نادر عبد الله المصري، أنا رياضي، يعني أنا مدرب منتخب فلسطين لألعاب القوى، مجال رياضي والحمد لله يعني معروف. كل الناس اللي عايشين هنا كلهم ناس يعني عمال، ناس بسيطين، في نساء، في أطفال، فيش عندنا مقاومة. احنا عايشين في حي يعني ناس يعني غلابة على قد الحال، يعني احنا تفاجأنا انه بدهم يقصفوا منزل جارنا. وبصراحة يعني اللي صار يعني شيء جيش الاحتلال لا يميز بين رياضي او سياسي او مقاوم او مواطن او طفل. كل قطاع غزة هو تحت القصف، واحنا شعب محاصر، واحنا ما عندناش الامكانيات ان احنا نضلنا نخش في حروب، يعني اجيال بتموت واحنا بندافع عن يعني هذه ارضنا واحنا بندافع عنها. وللأسف يعني جيش الاحتلال هو دائما مغتصب أراضينا.
While the armed resistance emerged largely unscathed, the Israeli mega-assault, the fourth in 12 years, took a grave toll on the civilian population and infrastructure, and further decimated an economy kept on life support through a trickle of foreign aid.
العدوان الأخير على قطاع غزة طبعاً استهدف البنية التحتية بشكل ممنهج. كان الهدف من العدوان تدمير البنية التحتية في قطاع غزة وتدمير الاقتصاد الفلسطيني في القطاع، وكل هذا من المؤشرات اللي كانت موجودة خلال الحرب. يعني العدوان استهدف كل الطرق الرئيسية، مفارق الطرق، استهدف اللي هو خطوط الناقلة للمياه الخارجة من آبار المياه، خطوط ناقلة رئيسية، الخطوط الرئيسية لشبكات الصرف الصحي، استهدف مضخات الصرف الصحي اللي بتنقل مياه الصرف الصحي إلى محطة المعالجة الرئيسية في منطقة الشيخ عجلين، استهدف الخطوط الناقلة للكهرباء. يعني قطاع غزة بغزيها حوالي 10 خطوط كهرباء بتيجي من الجانب الإسرائيلي، كانت 8 خطوط مدمرة خلال فترة الحرب. وقف اللي هي المعابر، طبعا هذا منع دخول اللي هو أشياء كثيرة ومنها السولار اللازم لتشغيل محطة توليد الكهرباء، وهذا أوقف المحطة. كان وصل التيار 4 ساعات في 24 ساعة. استهدف المنطقة الصناعية اللي هي أساس للصناعات الفلسطينية، واستهدف بعض المصانع الأخرى مثل مصنع اللي هو فومكو تبع الإسفنج، استهدف مصنع أو مخازن خضير اللي الاحتلال يعلم كل العلم بأن هذه المخازن تحتوي على كميات كبيرة من السموم اللي هي أدوية زراعية، تحتوي على ملوثات بيئية كثيرة. الهدف منه اللي هو تدمير هذا المصنع وعمل أكبر قدر ممكن من التلوث في المنطقة المحيطة فيه، والمنطقة اللي هناك هي كلها مناطق زراعية.
In 11 days, Israel killed 256 Palestinians and injured 2,000. 58,000 more were displaced and made homeless. Palestinian attacks were far less deadly, killing 13 Israelis and injuring 114. Despite losses, Hamas leader Yahya al-Sinwar emerged and walked through the streets of Gaza, an act of defiance against the militarily superior Israel that had bombed his house and office just days before. Sinwar dared the Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz to attack him, knowing that Israel could not risk renewing a war with his assassination.
أن ينتهي هذا اللقاء جزء كبير من مشواري وأنا مروح سأقطع مشيا على الأقدام. يعني بنحكي عن 50-60 دقيقة، 3600 ثانية. لديهم القدرة على أن يتخذوا القرار ولديهم القدرة على أن يذخروا الطائرة ويخرجوها ولن يرمش لي جفن.
Gaza's armed resistance achieved deterrence and proved its ability to intervene in occupied Jerusalem and defend the Al-Aqsa compound.
The lesson learned from the last Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip is that Israel is an occupation state that could be defeated, and it's not a firm state that has been depicted by the Israeli Zionist propaganda machine. Palestinians can get their liberation and retrieve their rights and freedom.
We are no longer here talking about Gaza defending itself against Israeli aggressions. We are talking about Gaza standing in solidarity and defense of Palestinians who are living similar states of sieges in East Jerusalem, in various parts of the West Bank. That kind of solidarity was so significant because it allowed Palestinians to finally claim some sort of national unity.
But for the people of Gaza, they are one suffer under siege, unable to rebuild, locked in their cage, and deprived of every right by Israel's military dictatorship. Yet their capacity to resist an occupier with the world's most advanced weaponry only grows stronger to match their will.
The Palestinian resistance military capabilities are not highly sophisticated and destructive, but it becomes so effective when it's used by Palestinian smart youths who believe in their rights and freedom.
Gaza in many ways became self-sufficient in terms of building and manufacturing their own weapons. And the other interesting thing is that the weapons that are actually manufactured in Gaza are more effective, larger in size, have greater explosive capabilities. By being able to develop these weapons in Gaza itself, they now have a much greater space to manipulate the size and the precision of these weapons.
The Israeli occupation experienced our military capabilities in the last Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip. The whole world saw it, and we still have more important capabilities in the shadow.
All right. And that was Gaza Fights Back, our new Mint Press News documentary that we just released about 1 week ago. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. In case you missed the introduction, we are doing a watch party, and we'll be joined by Motaz Aziza, who was a producer and cameraman on the ground in Gaza, who was an integral part, probably the most important part of making this film. And then we also have Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who's a journalist and author and just has an incredibly deep knowledge of Palestine and Gaza, and I think will really just bring a lot to the table, the discussion between these two. And then myself, I directed this film, and then from 2014 to 2017, I was able to spend about 7 months total on the Gaza Strip. And I made then the film Killing Gaza, which can also be seen on, if you just look on, you can go to killinggaza.com and see it there. It's also available on YouTube for free and in several languages. So I think we'll have a very fruitful discussion about Gaza and armed resistance and unarmed resistance and all things Palestine. So I'm going to welcome in our guests Here is Dr. Ramzy Baroud. Thanks very much, Ramzy, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure, of course. Thank you, Dan.
And then we have Motaz Aziza. Thanks, Motaz, for making it happen.
Your efforts to help us to show this.
I don't know. I think you were cutting out a little bit there, Motaz. Let's hope your connection is strong enough. But
you heard me good?
Yeah, it seems a little bit delayed to me. So we'll give it a shot and see what happens. Let's just kind of start the discussion and go from there. And anyone, in the chat, we can see the comments, and so feel free to ask questions. We appreciate super chats. We'll definitely get to any questions and super chats, and you can address any one of us. But so I guess first of all, Motaz, I wanted to ask you. Let's see. Hopefully the connection holds up enough. What was it like for you to, basically be out there, not just trying to survive during this 11-day onslaught, but also documenting these events, the bombings of the towers and so much destruction. What is that like for you?
Actually, to see bombing, for me, to see people, my country get killed and bomb army.
Motaz, it's a bit. It's kind of cutting out. I think we're getting about every other word. Is that? Are you hearing the same thing, Ramzy?
I am, yes, unfortunately.
Okay. Do you, Motaz, do you have another? The internet is bad there. Is there another connection you can use, Motaz?
Let me just.
Or maybe if you turn off your camera and then we can just listen to you, that will use less bandwidth.
Do you hear me good now? Or no?
Still not great.
Let me try this.
Okay. Motaz, why don't you see if you can find another connection if possible, and maybe rejoin us. We'll just get started with. I'll just get started with.
Okay.
With Dr. Ramzy, and we'll go from there. All right. So let's. Okay. So Dr. Ramzy, first of all, thanks for partaking in the project. I thought Dr. Ramzy's analysis and commentary really helped the film kind of fill in some holes, and there was so much that I wanted to use from what he said, because everything is so insightful, but we wanted to, for the pacing of the film, to keep things moving, we had to be very limited. But so first of all, thank you for your contribution to the film and for doing this live stream today. I want to just get your reaction to the film overall. What did you think of it? Is this the first time you had sat down and watched it, or had you seen it before?
I've seen it before, and I discovered new things watching it the second time, Dan. And I must say a very big congratulations to you and to Mu'taz and to your team. This is the quality of this film is really top notch, not only in terms of the technical making of the film, but in its ability to really kind of handle so many different parts of this discussion. Whenever we see Gaza in context, in Western media, but frankly, even sometimes in Middle Eastern media, well, quite often as well in Middle Eastern media, if I'm to be honest, something is being chopped up. It's either you focus on the tragic element or the militancy, or perceiving Palestinians as a terrorist and so forth and so on. in this case, you kind of saw so many elements interacting to create something new and different about Gaza, where you see the humanity. I mean, there were so many touching moments that really, I mean, you know, I am from Gaza. I was born and raised in Gaza. I live and breathe Gaza, yet at the same time, you still get so deeply emotional and your voice starts cracking and you can't help but feeling teary over and over again. The scene of the man who was recalling the memories of the 21 or 22 members of the family that were killed, the scene of the doctor who was brought to the courtyard of the Ashifa compound, the autistic girl who's screaming, doesn't know how to express her feelings, and just it breaks your heart over and over again. Yet on the other hand, it doesn't take away from the power of the analysis. Something has indeed fundamentally shifted in the way that Israel operates in Gaza, in the relationship between Israel and Gaza. And we can't pretend that this is not the case, maybe because we are so used to this idea of Gaza either the perpetual victim or Gaza the perpetual terrorist. And then we are missing all of these new indicators. And I think the film does such a good job in starting a new conversation on Gaza. And I really do hope that other filmmakers and scholars and analysts kind of pick up where the film left off regarding this issue.
Well, thank you very, very much. I appreciate that. And, you know, maybe that's, I don't know, maybe it's just because I spent time in Gaza, so I got a sense of what is the connection between everyday people and resistance. You know, people who decide to join the resistance, and I don't know, it seemed really important to me to portray that. Let's see, we're gonna try to bring Motaz in again. Let's see if it works.
Hi, I hope.
How about now? Let's see.
To work. It's
sounds.
How it's now?
Sounds it's. Yeah, I think it's not really working, Motaz. It's kind of broken again.
Is what I try. I'm trying my best.
No, I understand. Yeah, I understand completely. Is there anywhere else you can go, Motaz? Do you think you can find another signal anywhere?
Use the 4G connection. I will try with my phone.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. So we'll take Motaz out there while he kind of figures his situation out. Hopefully we can improve it. But yeah, I think when, as an outsider, perhaps it's really easy to, when you follow Palestine, it's really easy to fall into maybe a lazy surface level narrative of, or maybe it's just exhausting for some people, where you think, there are these constant violations and provocations and constant violence meted out against Palestinians, in particular, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, and Gaza, all over the place. And it feels like it can feel like nothing is changing. But I think, as Dr. Ramzy was alluding to, or just saying so clearly, when you examine the changes happening not only inside Gaza and throughout Palestine, but also in the region, I think you begin to understand that the situation is actually changing. And that's really what we saw, is that for the first time, the armed resistance groups in Gaza were able not to just fend off an Israeli mega attack, but they were actually able to intervene in Jerusalem against provocations from from Israel, the Israeli government, Israeli settlers in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and in the Al-Aqsa compound, where I've documented, and I have another documentary coming out, but I've followed these groups very closely, of Israeli settlers that seek really nothing less than the total destruction of the Al-Aqsa compound, and they're wholly supported by the Israeli government. So that's another project we'll be working on and finishing for Mint Press News this year. But yeah, I mean, it's there's so much happening, and for someone who can really, I mean, I don't speak fluent Arabic, so I'm not able to really get the level of detail that native Arabic speakers can understand about the daily happenings in Gaza, the political changes throughout Palestine. Um, but obviously, there's a major change in what the armed resistance has been capable of doing over between the last year 2021, from 2014, from 2012, and 2008 and 9 before that. So maybe Ramzy, if you could kind of elaborate on sort of the evolution of armed resistance in Gaza and how significant of a role it plays in Palestine today.
Absolutely. I'm gonna take you a bit earlier than the 2008-9 war, 2012, 14, 21, and so forth. A bit, and earlier. I was born and raised in the Gaza Strip in a refugee camp called Nusayrat. That's where the Al-Qassam brigades actually started, and they started with 4 children. Really, I mean, they were older than me in school. That they looked, like men, but they were actually teachers, and then they formed this group called Al-Qassam. And I remember the day that, and we knew who they were, these kids. And I remember when they had a single gun, and it was something that was, I think, was either stolen or bought from from Israel itself, and that was the Hamas militant fighting force. It was these 4 children, and Israel killed every single one of them, along with members of their families, tortures, interrogations, all sorts of things. And that was supposed to be the end of the movement. Now, if you really think about the massive expansion in the movement, not just in the Hamas armed wing, but also Islamic Jihad, also the socialists. We rarely talk about the socialists, but I really think we should talk about the armed resistance of the various socialist movements in Gaza. It's a completely different reality than that started in the first few months of the first Intifada in 1987. Israel at that time had zero regards to armed resistance. It did not prevent Israel from entering, invading the refugee camps, killing, arresting, demolishing homes. It was of no consequence as far as Israel was concerned. Later on, however, that became a different story. The resistance have grown exponentially in terms of size, in terms of capabilities, and every single stage of conflict kind of almost see like a new reborn type of resistance that learned from the various mistakes of the previous wars, introduced new tactics, and so forth and so on. Now, I think it's so very important that we understand we are still dealing with Israel, a country with the nuclear capabilities and more, and the Palestinians who are making their own rockets, in underground tunnels. So let's not have any illusions about the disparity of power between both sides, but we also have to keep in mind that at this rate of growth, Israel is now beginning to take the resistance, the armed resistance, as a serious factor in its political decision making. This is, in my mind, unprecedented, since not only since the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip in 1967, but since the rise of the Fidayeen movement in the late 40s and early 50s in Gaza. Suddenly the resistance is an actually strategic alternative, and Palestinians are using it as such, and that is terribly worrying for Israel, because the equation has finally changed in favor of the Palestinians.
Right, exactly. That's these are really important points you bring up. I mean, when I think about Israel's policy, it has kind of different policies for different and different forms of occupation for different groups of Palestinians. I mean, obviously, the conditions in Gaza are different from that of inside the 48 territories, what is considered modern day Israel, the ever growing and expanding amorphous blob known as Israel. And then and then there are multiple kind of different forms of policy and occupation even inside the 48. In the Negev desert, there's a ethnic cleansing going on, and that's considered inside so-called democratic Israel. And then you have, of course, the policies throughout the West Bank of kind of the face-to-face occupation, where it's a bit different than the extreme violence from distance that's carried out in Gaza. And then, of course, in East Jerusalem, a sort of different a different flavor of occupation there too. And I think the significance of what the armed resistance groups in Gaza, and as you said, not only Al-Qassam, but the various groups, they were able to send a very clear message to Israel that Palestine, despite the political kind of disagreement and fighting between political factions, and the physical and geographical differences, that there is a sense of national unity among the masses, among the people. And when you look at the celebrations across Palestine, whether inside 48 or in the West Bank or Jerusalem, in support of Gaza's armed resistance, it really kind of speaks volumes, I think, and in particular in defense of the Al-Aqsa compound, which is of course the most important site, not only religiously, which of course it is, one of the most important sites in Islam, but also just as a national symbol in Palestine. So when there have been mass demonstrations in 2017, you had people with a wide variety of political backgrounds, from completely secular liberals, conservative, anything, Islamist, atheists, all standing in defense of Al-Aqsa. And so it really, to me, one of the take-home messages is, or I guess one of the underlying messages is that Al-Aqsa is so central, and that's why, and so seeing it's so central to Palestinian kind of consciousness and national identity, not only in a religious way, that seeing Gaza step in to defend Al-Aqsa from increasing provocations and attacks, where the Palestinians of Jerusalem are basically unable to really do anything like that, really is powerful and can't be overstated, I think.
I agree, Dan. I think there's another important element that we need to add to this particular point that you have raised, and that is, for a long time there has been some sort of a division in the way that we discuss Palestine. Academically, in the media, in the news, you have the Gaza-centered Palestine, and then you have Palestine 48, and then you have the West Bank Palestinians who are divided themselves into areas A, B, C. You have East Jerusalem, and it seemed for a long time, as we are talking about various fights with no particular context that unify all of these fights. I think what happened in 2021 wasn't, and this is a reductionist approach that I have when they discuss Palestine, it wasn't a discussion about what type of resistance should Palestinians use or don't use. This is not about versus non-violent resistance. These kind of academic, discussions that some people can afford having outside that reality that you have demonstrated very key in your film is really not relevant to what is actually happening in Palestine itself. I think the biggest achievement of what happened in 2021 is that the resistance in Palestine, whether in Sheikh Jarrah, whether in Gaza or anywhere else in Palestine, proved capable of articulating its resistance in different methods, yet at the same time still fighting the same battle. And that is different. That is different than many of the fights that we've had in the past. And I think Israel perhaps was hoping that there will be no repeat of that in 2022. They tried to provoke separate fights with Palestinians to again divide the Palestinian resistance once more. And I think they have terribly failed. So in some sense, there's this search for the elusive Palestinian unity, Hamas, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas, this and that. I think that search might have ended finally. And we might actually be talking about real Palestinian unity displaying itself, not in the resistance itself only, but in the hundreds of thousands who poured into the streets of Palestine, outside Palestine, celebrating the unity of the Palestinian people.
Absolutely, well stated. And I think, one of the things that the film doesn't touch on, and I sort of wish it did, but with limited kind of time and resources, we didn't get into it. But of course, there was a massive uprising throughout Palestine that was just not seen, and it hadn't been seen in the same way, and it really caught Israel off guard. So at the same time that it was bombing Gaza to smithereens, there was huge unrest particularly in mixed cities, where you had not only Palestinians rising up, but also Israeli fanatics, hard right wing, not only settlers, but throughout all of the entire country, coming and basically attacking Palestinians. And so that really was terrible PR for Israel, but also sent such a clear message, in my opinion, and not only throughout Palestine, but in the region, in the refugee camps, in Jordan, and in Lebanon, and so, of course, people are watching all of this stuff. And then there were huge demonstrations in Europe, across the world. I think in Latin America too, against this massive onslaught. So, I mean, even to the point where I'm going to show this headline that I came across. Let me just, here it is. Let me pull it up. So, the incredible solidarity that we saw and the consciousness emanating from Gaza throughout Palestine, the region, and even the world is just remarkable to me. And, I hope we can kind of just capture a tiny bit of that in this film. But let me see if I can pull up this this article. Here we go. So this is from the Atlantic Council. If anyone isn't familiar with the Atlantic Council, this is kind of the head think tank of NATO. So just a complete imperial kind of brain trust that is very much involved in war against Russia and Ukraine and China too. So really just the imperial brain trust of here in Washington D.C. And they actually declared right after the fighting ended, for all its achievements in battle, Israel is losing the war. So that's the assessment of essentially the establishment of the kind of permanent war state in the U.S. that Israel actually lost. What is your sense of the significance of that statement, Ramzy?
That's right. Israel is losing. Israel has been losing for quite times, in fact. And I think we also have to keep widen the context a little bit and talk about Israel's loss to the resistance in South Lebanon, in Lebanon in general, and how that impacted the collective Palestinian psyche, empowered the resistance in Gaza and elsewhere. But there is something else that I think is important and we must mention here. And that is, since the very, very beginning, and I'm not even talking about the Nakba, I'm not talking about the catastrophic destruction of the Palestinian homeland in 1948. I am talking about the very start of the Zionist movements and the beginning of the colonial adventure in Palestine. It seemed as if the Zionists were in control. They had a plan, and the blueprint led to something else and something else. But eventually, it was a plan, and the plan was information. And they were. It seemed that they were the only party that is capable of advancing an agenda and determining outcomes. This has ended. Israel is no longer in that position anymore. Those who have witnessed Yes, we speak about Gaza and the West Bank and Sheikh Jarrah, but what happened in what described as mixed cities within Israel itself, within Palestine 48, that new. The fact that those Palestinians haven't been marginalized, they haven't been operating devoid of identity and a sense of belonging to a larger whole called the Palestinian people. And as if we are back in the war of 1948 all over again. Where was the achievement of Israel over the last 75 years? So not only Israel is no longer in the position of determining outcomes by itself, but also the Palestinian people have reinvented themselves and rediscovered that the roots. And we go back to the fight that my grandfather and many elder Palestinians, whether dead or alive, have fought in 48. We are back to that starting point, as if everything that the Zionists have achieved suddenly evaporated. And that's really where I think that headline works very well. Israel is losing the war, but Israel is losing the overall war, and Israel is losing that agenda that has been written many years ago and has been in formation throughout the years. Israel is operating with no plan. And this is really, really new in this conflict.
Yeah, it seems like Israel, even internally, is in such an kind of unstable. It's so unstable politically. If you completely ignore Palestinians, Israel's unstable politically. I mean, how many governments have collapsed they're going to elections again, and for what, the fourth time in 5 or 6 years, something like this. So it seems that I don't know if Zionism has entered some kind of terminal phase. I don't want to make, huge declarations. But I think Ramzy, you don't need to turn yourself off. I can turn you on and off. You can come back. I can to make sure you're still with us. But I think there are, that Israel has. I do wonder if it's entered a terminal phase politically, if its internal instability, the complete dominance of this sort of apocalyptic, ultra right wing, fanatical sect that a couple decades ago was considered beyond the pale, and extremists and terrorists even are now dominant in Israeli politics and have been kind of rehabilitated as the next phase of Zionism, but they're completely ideological, not based in any kind of reality. Even if you look at the labor Zionists and the kind of ruling parties up until the 1980s and into 90s, when the so-called peace agreements were really a matter of they wanted to normalize and have some kind of because they realized it was good for their interests, not because they desired actual peace with Egypt or anything like that, or the creation of the Palestinian Authority was not for peace, but because they realized it was an incredible asset to have Palestinians essentially police themselves on behalf of Israel. And so now this ultra ideological apocalyptic sect has very much taken over the center of Israeli politics. And the old guard, they're like, it's like dinosaurs falling off of a cliff. So what is your sense as kind of Palestinians maybe become more organized and the political differences kind of melt away and armed resistance complements unarmed resistance, and the increasing organization in comparison to the opposite in Israel? What's your sense of that?
It's interesting then how the tables have turned as far as the Israelis and the Palestinians and their relationship to this so-called conflict. Throughout the years, it seemed that the Israelis had figured it out. They had a plan. They were organized. They were everything was done in advance, regardless of the political ideology of the party, Likud or Labor or any others. Somehow they found their common denominator. While the Palestinians, understandably to some extent, of course, They were shattered, disunited, overwhelmed, bewildered, and there are reasons for that. I do not justify Palestinian disunity, but I feel like when you are the oppressed and colonized party, it's kind of easy for you to kind of lose sight of your priorities. But it seems that things have changed now. It seems that there is a process of rebuilding some sort of a political cohesion within Palestine that is centered around the idea of the resistance. And that's very, very good. But on the other hand, you have this sense of loss, intellectually, politically, ideologically, that is taking place in Israel. It seems that what really unified the Israelis throughout the years is the fact that they are a colonial project. Therefore, the hate for Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and so forth and so on. But now that they feel triumphant and that the colonial project has succeeded and their settlements are dotting the West Bank and East Jerusalem has really more or less been conquered from a demographic point of view, their demographic point of view, it seems that they have no goal, no ambition that is capable of keeping them united. And this is really, I think, the crux of Israel's political disunity. The fact that they held 4 elections and now they are going to hold the 5th election within 2.5, 3 years. I mean, I think that's just fascinating. Yes, Israeli politics is inherently unstable, but not to this extent. These are political parties with no objective or no goal. They would go wherever their constituent wants them to go. The labor, or rather the center, but also to some extent the labor, is now committing to the very ideal of the Likud. You can't even tell the difference anymore between left, right, and center. They don't want to talk about a peace process. They don't want to talk about the Palestinians, period. But here are the Palestinians. They are real. They are growing in numbers. They are growing in influence. They are growing in terms of their resistance, and they have to deal with this issue. Israel is under the impression that we are still living the years of the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, where they would just go and, kill a number of Palestinians in Gaza and just get away with it and feel triumphant, and that's the end of the story. That is not happening anymore. The term that the Israeli government used for that, or the Israeli military rather, is time to mow the grass. So they go to Gaza, they kill a bunch of people, and then a politician receives more votes. A government is saved from being voted out in the Knesset. But there is a huge price now to pay for these political gambles. In fact, I think if there was no political price to pay, the Naftali Bennett government would have bombed Gaza for sure to save itself from being voted out. Maybe it would have been their last resort before, having to dissolve the Knesset and call for another election. So suddenly the Palestinians, who at one point were irrelevant in Israel's political calculations, suddenly they are at the very center and the very heart of Israeli politics. So times have changed, and I think we have lost Dan for now. Hopefully he'll get back.
No, I'm here. I'm just listening to you. I wanted to keep the attention on you instead of me just, nodding along, which I'm doing anyway. So nice, no, I'm here. But yeah, I mean, you've just laid out so much in such an erudite way. I mean, to me, seeing, Palestinians have, I guess one thing I saw with the intervening in Jerusalem, it's almost a strange concept to think of, Palestinians being able to intervene, for Gaza to be able to intervene. It's so remarkable. And to say that, I mean, it's not aggression, of course, because, an occupied people by definition simply cannot carry out any aggression, because they're the victims of aggression. However, the subjects of aggression. However, they did make a statement to Israel saying, as we show in the beginning of the documentary, withdraw your forces by this time. So they drew a red line, and Israel, ignored it. And so, to me, I would say the Palestinians kind of had agency in that episode, which is really remarkable, and I think maybe is one of the big reasons it inspired people so much, and at least for me, that's it's such a huge point. What's your sense of that?
I think that's the right term, Dan, that you used, agency. I mean, agency is such a critical element in politics and policy making. And the fact that not only Palestinians had no agency, I mean, well, they have agency, but not enough agency that could actually influence Israeli tactics and strategies and decision making. And the fact that they have it and they are using it, and they are really using, this is not about guns and bullets and rockets. And quite often the discussion on Gaza ends up veering into that direction, that this is about military capabilities per se. I mean, look at the West Bank. The Palestinian security of Mahmoud Abbas have tens of thousands of well-trained security personnel, trained by, I don't know, the CIA, by the Americans, by the Jordanians. It doesn't make any difference. So it's not changing any outcomes. Palestinians in the West Bank don't have that kind of influence on how Israel, the Israeli occupation and Israeli military operations in the West Bank. So this is not about the actual size of the military. It's about the use of that military and how do you use it for political and strategic reasons. For example, when the Palestinians resistance a few weeks ago showed a video of a very, very short video. I'm sure you've seen it, Dan, of the Israeli prisoner, the Israeli captive in Gaza, showing that he is in ill health. The timing of that, it was just before the collapse of the Israeli government. And they have been holding that a secret. The Israelis have, not only the Israelis declared him dead, they actually held a symbolic funeral. And it comes out of nowhere. The patience, the calculations, this is using resistance for strategic purposes. And the Israelis are fuming because the Palestinians have learned they are learning the ropes, and they know how to play the game, and it's actually working.
Right. Yes, absolutely. There's so many instances I can think of where there's been incredibly just brilliant strategy displayed by Palestinian kind of resistance forces. I remember, oh wow, this must have been 2017 or 2018. The armed resistance in Gaza targeted a bus of that had just emptied of Israeli soldiers, showing
2015,
that
I believe.
yeah. So showing that it had the capability to target vehicles that way, that it could have killed, an entire bus full of young Israeli soldiers, which would of course just been a huge catastrophe for Israel politically. But Hamas essentially sent a message that we can do this, but this is not what we desire. So it was very calculated, and just shows the evolution of their strategy and their thinking. One thing I want to ask you is about the relationship between. We talked a little bit about unarmed resistance and armed resistance, and I think there tends to be, as you were saying, kind of a focus on, well, is it, what's better, or when is it justified to launch rockets, because civilians can die and this sort of thing. And as you said, these discussions are very academic and have no relation to reality in Gaza, which is my sense too. These are not discussions that anyone in Gaza has. And it's purely kind of a bourgeois outside looking in academic exercise. But I think it is important to understand maybe what I would call a complementary relationship between unarmed resistance, like the Great March of Return, and armed resistance, as rockets and guns and bullets, as you described. So what is your sense of the relationship between the two, unarmed resistance and armed resistance?
That's right. It is really purely academic discussion. And this comes from a situation where people, there is not just bourgeois, but also there is a colonial mindset involved here, where we kind of look at faraway places and we kind of take these moral decisions. How do you feel about Saddam Hussein? Do you like Gaddafi or do you hate Gaddafi? And without really fully comprehending and understanding in context what sort of issues we are dealing with here. In Arabic, the term for resistance is muqawama. Muqawama is used in all the contexts you can think of, whether artistic, cultural, popular, grassroots, or military, but still the same term. In the minds of Palestinians, muqawama cannot be divided. It is the same principle. For those outside, they have to pick and choose as if it's, as if it's some sort of a soccer game, but it's not. It's not. We've watched this, some of the harrowing footage that in your film, and when you kind of see these towers just imploding and being sucked into the earth, and in the type of missiles that Israel uses, the one that creates this massive air vacuum and massive craters, and just brings all the buildings with all the people inside it down, and to just sit there and tell the people, well, what do you think? Maybe this sort of resistance works as opposed to that other kind of resistance. It's laughable notion. I remember Noam Chomsky once having this during the Iraq War, and I think he was being interviewed by David Bersamian, if I remember correctly, and he was asked, many Americans are asking, what do we do about the war? How do we prevent the war from happening? And his answer said, this is really interesting that only Americans ask, or rather people who are privileged ask, what do we do? He says, in India, in Palestine, in Algeria, when people face injustices, they don't ask what they do, they just do it. So we need to trust the Palestinians, not only that they are doing it, that they know exactly what they are doing. This is why, as you said, they could have taken that bus out, but they didn't, because they were thinking strategically. They could fire rockets from Sheikh Jarrah, but they are not, because they know that grassroots popular resistance works in Sheikh Jarrah. So they are applying resistance in a very strategic way to various geopolitical or geographical spaces, and they are applying it correctly. They make mistakes, they learn from these mistakes, as they have throughout history. I think we need to trust in their ability of making the right decisions about what kind of resistance, when, and how, as opposed to us lecturing and talking at them and making these judgments. I like Hamas, I don't like Fatah, I like Sha'biya, and so forth and so on. It doesn't work that way. It's not pick and choose. It's people fighting for their freedom and for their rights to exist, and they will use whatever channels that is available and whatever means in their disposal to make that happen. Dan, I hate to say this, but I have another commitment, and I must run out.
No problem
I wish
at all.
that Marquez was with us, because really we would love to hear from him more about his experience.
Well, we'll do this again. It's great to be able to speak with you, and I really appreciate your time, and we'll get Motaz on a better connection, and definitely we'll do this again, because I think the discussion we're having and your expertise is, there's not really anywhere else you're going to get it. I mean, aside from your work itself. So thank you so much again for your contribution to the film, for your support, and for doing this stream with me.
Thank you very much, and Mabruk once more for the documentary. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. So I thought that was a really enlightening conversation with Dr. Ramzy Baroud, who really does not get enough credit for what a powerful intellectual and journalist and incredibly dedicated man he is to his craft and to the cause of liberation of Palestine. I feel very privileged to know him. So, of course, there was more I want to discuss with him, but we'll save that for another time. So, thanks again, everyone, for joining in the Gaza Fights Back watch party. And I hope everyone feels inspired to resist, not in the Hillary Clinton hashtag resist kind of way, but in the Gaza resistance kind of way. And so please share this feed on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, whatever social media you use. It's again, we're suppressed by algorithms. Mint Press News faces huge suppression. So help us beat the algorithms and get this material out. And thank you very much for joining in. Make sure to leave comments on YouTube so I'll see them and just share it around. And thanks again.